Sarah had always loved the stillness of her secluded countryside home. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustle of city life, it was her perfect escape from the noise of the world. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and thick stone walls that kept out both the cold and the rest of humanity. It had been her grandparents' home, a place filled with memories of long, peaceful summers and quiet nights by the fire. But that all changed one cold November night. The first thing Sarah noticed was the silence. Not the comforting kind she was used to, but an unnerving, suffocating silence that pressed in on her from all sides. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. No wind rustling through the trees, no chirping of crickets. Just nothing. That night, Sarah sat in her armchair by the fire, a book in hand, but she couldn't focus. The oppressive silence gnawed at her nerves. Every creak of the house seemed louder, sharper, as though the very structure was alive, groaning beneath some invisible weight. At midnight, a strange sound cut through the silence, a faint knock. Sarah looked up, her heart quickening. The knock came again, a slow, deliberate sound, as if someone or something was testing her. She stood up, her pulse pounding in her ears, and made her way to the front door. The knocking continued, steady and calm, each rap sending shivers down her spine. She peered through the peephole. Nothing, just the cold, dark expanse of the woods stretching out beyond the porch. The knocking stopped the moment she looked, leaving her standing in the eerie silence once more. Slowly, she opened the door, letting the freezing air rush in. Her breath misted in front of her as she stepped outside. No one was there. The woods were still, too still. She stepped back inside, locking the door, her heart still racing. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the house settling or a branch tapping against the side. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The knocking started again, this time from the back of the house. Sarah froze. It was the same slow, deliberate rhythm. Her skin prickled with fear as she realized that whoever or whatever was knocking was circling the house, moving from door to window, window to door, never hurrying, always knocking 3 times before moving on. It was like it was waiting for her to answer. Her phone was in the living room. She sprinted to grab it, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. No signal. She cursed under her breath. The isolation she had once cherished now felt like a death trap. She was completely alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, cut off from help. The knocking grew louder, as if whatever was outside knew she was panicking. And then the voice came, low, distorted, like someone speaking underwater. Sarah. Her name echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stood frozen, her body trembling with fear. Sarah, let me in. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an unmistakable weight of malevolence. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the voice only grew louder. Sarah, come to the window. The voice was closer now, directly outside the living room window. Slowly, against every instinct in her body, Sarah turned to face it. The curtains fluttered, as if touched by a breeze, though there was no wind. She could just make out the shape of something standing outside, something tall and thin, its features hidden in the shadows. Her breath hitched as the knocking resumed, this time right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and her breath came out in ragged gasps. She ran for the kitchen, her mind screaming for escape, but every step she took, the knocking followed. It was as if the sound was inside her head now, relentless and mocking. Let me in. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house. But Sarah hadn't unlocked any doors. She backed into the corner, eyes wide, her knife raised. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the hall, approaching the kitchen. Sarah, let me in. The voice was right behind her. With a scream, she spun around, slashing wildly at the empty air. But there was nothing, just the darkness pressing in around her, suffocating her. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. And then, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the kitchen was plunged into complete darkness. When the lights flickered back on, she saw it. Standing at the end of the hall, tall and gaunt, its face hidden behind a veil of shadow. Its eyes, or what she thought were eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light. It stood unnaturally still, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She was paralyzed with fear as the thing tilted its head, as if observing her. Slowly, deliberately, it began to move toward her, its footsteps echoing louder with each step. "Let me in." It was no longer a request. It was a demand. Sarah bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She threw the door open and ran out into the freezing night, her bare feet crunching on the frosty ground. She didn't dare look back as she sprinted through the woods, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, the voice echoed through the trees. "Let me in!" It followed her, relentless, growing louder with each passing second. And then, silence. Sarah stopped, gasping for breath, her heart thudding in her ears. She stood in the middle of the dark woods, alone and shivering, her breath coming out in ragged puffs of mist. The house was nowhere in sight. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. And then, from behind her, the knocking started again. Slow, deliberate. "Let me in." This time, she knew there was no escape. The silence of the woods closed in around her, suffocating, as the darkness swallowed her whole.